Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Harris, here with the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network and the Environmental Law Institute, where I'm Director of Tribal Programs and the Deputy Director of the Center for State, Tribal, and Local Environmental Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure, SPCC Rule 101 for Local and Tribal Governments. This is a program sponsored by the Local Government Environmental Assistance Network, or LGEN, which ELI manages under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I encourage you to follow the events page on LGEN's website, lgen.net, and to connect with us on social media for future programs. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we have time set aside for a question and answer session. So please ask these leading experts your questions. You can submit your questions through GoToWebinar's question box. Please don't wait until the end. You can send your questions as soon as you think of them. Next slide, please. We're very fortunate to have an EPA expert on these issues here with us today. Mark Howard is an environmental scientist with the headquarters office of the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Emergency Management, Regulation Implementation Division in Washington, D.C. He is the SPCC National Technical Expert. He also serves as the SPCC Team Leader, National Project Manager for the Inspectors Training Program, the Oil Program Representative Instructor for the OSC Academy, and the lead for the Oil Program Technical Work Group. He is also the lead technical member of the SPCC Rulemaking Work Group and is one of the authors of the SPCC Rule. So, wow, very impressive. Mark will be providing an overview of the SPCC Rule, and then we will turn to Q&A with Kelly Brantner with the WECA Office of Civil Enforcement and John Costco with the WECA Office of Compliance. Next slide, please. To set some context for today's discussion, when we think of oil discharges, that brings to mind news coverage about the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion or the Exxon Valdez running aground. But many oil discharges, in fact, originate from onshore facilities, places where oil is produced or stored, or facilities that are end users of oil. These facilities have to comply with the SPCC rule, developed to prevent oil discharges from reaching navigable waters. Next slide, please. This includes local and tribal governments. Think of all the places governments store oil. Fueling areas for motor pools, police and fire stations, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, road maintenance facilities, sewer pump stations, emergency generators. But just what are your responsibilities under the SPCC rule? That's what we're covering here today specifically. Next slide. So without further ado, let's get started. Mark?
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Thumbs up.
Okay, great, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate your time today. First, I want to thank the WECA and the Environmental Law Institute for setting this up. We're always excited to get the word out. And my rather long resume, one thing that just should highlight, because there's a connection, I worked with localities quite a bit. I was an on-scene coordinator with the state of Virginia, so I ran the area north of Richmond all the way to DC. So I worked with all of our localities here in Virginia, and of course we're a Commonwealth, so that puts an interesting spin. I have two other people just want to say hi real quick. They're going to help us at the end. Kelly Brantner, you want to say hello real quick, and any opening remarks on your end?
Sure, I just wanted to say hi. My name is Kelly Brantner, and I'm an attorney in the Office of Civil Enforcement, and I am the lead attorney for all SPCC issues regarding enforcement. So I'm glad to be here, and I'll be available at the end to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you, Kelly. John, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is John Costco with the Office of Compliance. I'm an environmental engineer, and our Office of Compliance primarily provides training to SPCC EPA inspectors, but we also provide some education outreach to facilities that need to comply with the SPCC rule.
Great, well, thank you. And again, as you guys know, you got the pretty much the whole SPCC team, everything from implementation, enforcement, and inspection support and outreach. So let's get started. I hate to start off with one of these, but it's just a real quick legal disclaimer. When you've been sued, I guess, just what it boils down to is our regulations, our statutory language, and our preambles and guidance are what drive how we, judge compliance. And if I misspeak, you don't want to use Mark Howard said as a defense. So I apologize, but it's just one of those things. I've checked the box. So let's talk about SPCC. This is where I talk about, responsibilities, and certainly I'm really thrilled to do this because I number one, I really enjoy working with our tribal partners and particularly folks on the response end, and the same with our localities, because like I said, I used to do quite a bit of work with our counties up here, so I appreciate your time. So when I think about roles here, I'm thinking there's two kinds of people that we may have. Those, well, maybe three. One, general interest. One, you may have a facility that's regulated, and you want to learn more or see what to look out for. And then the third is like the tribal, and they have on tribal lands, they may have production facilities and what to look for, and that are problematic, so you can help EPA target, or a locality that has a problem facility that may not be in compliance with our rule that can then again work with us to target. So those roles are kind of what I'm looking to get to satisfy this this presentation. So I know that you guys sit in different chairs, but hopefully you all get something from that. So let's talk about the oil regulation. So EPA, our program, we have the authority to do the regulatory provisions, and what that really means is we create regulations for spill prevention. In the Clean Water Act, we're given that authority under 311J of the Clean Water Act. And it's a very interesting statutory language because it's just a very simple paragraph that tasks the agency with requiring facilities to develop these plans. And then under OPA, it was modified to include FRP. So let me real quickly kind of tell you how these two work together. So under the 40 CFR Part 112 oil spill prevention regulation, there are two rules that kind of work in tandem. The spill prevention, control, and countermeasure, which we're talking about today. Think of that as the things that you're going to do to prevent a spill or react to a spill to keep it on your property. We roughly regulate about 500,000 facilities around the country. Our highest risk facilities then also have an additional requirement under the FRP regulation. So these are facilities typically with more than 1 million gallons or transfer over water and have greater than 42,000 gallons. So again, these are the highest risk facilities, and in addition to the prevention portion, there's a preparedness requirement for about 3,800 facilities that requires them to develop a facility response plan, which is oil is in the water, what are you going to do? And looking at it from 3 response levels. So we're going to cover SPCC today, and the goal is to never have to use your FRP because you're going to prevent it from ever happening. That's what SPCC is about. The sister regulation is 40 CFR Part 112. It's sometimes called the Sheen Rule, but if you've heard of RQs, this is the very simple. If you look at the way the rule was put together, it's a visual acuity test. So if you see a sheen, that is an oil gets to water of the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and causes a sheen, that's reportable to the federal government. But that's important. All of our authorities are based on the ability or a requirement to report if oil hits water. If oil hits the land and doesn't get to water, it gets a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about that. But 40 CFR defines essentially what the discharge of oil is, who you have to report it to, which is the NRC, that's manned by the Coast Guard, and it establishes our harmful quantity, which is sheen, a violation of a water quality standard, an emulsion, or a sinking oil. All those hitting water are reportable. So what's the purpose of the SPCC rule? It's quite straightforward. what it boils down to is we're developing plans. Some of them are PE certified, some of them can be self-certified, and with some of the localities, you know, I think you certainly could take advantage of our self-certification, which is a massive savings in costs relative to developing the plan. But both of those are looking at things that you're going to do. You develop the plan, but the single most important thing is developing and implementing. I'm gonna touch at the end another free webinar for you. I hate to advertise during somebody else's webinar, but we have coming up in 2 weeks an analysis of the inspection data from FY 18 and 19 that we did, and we looked at the most common violations. So I will invite you to attend that, and I'll tell you how to get that later. So again, our authorities are under the Clean Water Act. Now I got to get act fancy, so I don't offend any of our attorneys online. So it's the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, otherwise known as the Clean Water Act, Section 311 J1C is our authority. So enough of the good stuff, and let's get down to the bottom line. So SPCC, let's take that acronym and look at it. It's a spill prevention control countermeasure plan. So containment, that is the kind of cornerstone. You got to have containment, secondary containment around your primary container being your tank. Also look at tank testing, control methods. What are you going to do to prevent discharges? Countermeasures, if one of your secondary containment measures fails, what are you going to do? It's a performance-based rule and makes compliance kind of interesting. So in short, and this doesn't exist, but to illustrate why we, from a policy standpoint, chose this is we regulate a lot of different facilities, everywhere from production to gas plants that collect liquid. We don't regulate gas, but they may knock out liquids, to the refining process, where the crude oil is then broken into, I call it broken into pieces. I'm sure the chemical engineers would be offended, but they are broken into the pieces that we use in commerce, whether it's jet fuel, it could be naphtha, asphaltene type products, and all of those are stored. Then they go to a terminal, then they could go to a bulk plant, and then they go to an end user. That entire universe, except the transportation between those, are regulated by EPA. So we chose a performance-based methodology of rule making, which allows us to set a performance goal as opposed to a prescriptive thing that you have to follow. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Compliance dates, pretty straightforward. If you have a facility, you must have the plan in place prior to the beginning of operation. I always say what that means is it's the first oil truck that brings oil to your facility, not the first truck that takes oil out of your facility if you're like a terminal. But for most of you guys are end users. So this means the first time you put oil in that tank, you have to have the plan. Now, recognize on the setup for this operation, you may be asked to press the piping, and when I mean press, test the piping or the tank system with fuel in it. You should have the plan in place when you're doing that. It's not just when you say, hey, we're open. It's whenever you put oil in the tank. There is a little bit of relief for production facilities. We do give them 6 months to kind of stabilize operations, encourage green completion, and let them kind of stabilize, you know, what kind of containers are going to be there. And then at 6 months, they have to have their plan prepared and implemented. But that's only for oil production. I'm going to mention this. The slides that you see that are white with green are little tidbits out of our guidance document. Certainly, if you get a chance, we'll give you the website. I'm going to give you a backdoor to get to it. It's much easier. But it's www.epa.gov/oil spill, and it gets you right to the page for all of our information. We'll touch on this again. But part of that is our guidance for regional inspectors. And you're kind of going, well, why would I care about that? It's really written from the paradigm of not only inspectors, but the regulated community. This is a document we created to try to maintain as much consistency between the regulated community and our inspectors, because everyone knows what the expectations are. So it's 911 pages long, a lot of information in there, worth taking a look at. Applicability. Normally when I teach, I just taught a course yesterday, a 4-hour course at the International Oil Spill Conference, and it took, oh boy, almost an hour to go through these, but you won't find these directly in the rule. I've kind of created my own set of tests, and if you follow through this, you can very easily do a determination of if your facility is regulated. So the first one's easy. You're doing one of these verbs. Your storing is probably the one that gets everybody. The other one that's tricky is use. Use is also something that we regulate. What do I mean by use? Oil-filled operational equipment or oil-filled equipment, transformers, hydraulic units, anything that you may have in your locality where the oil is inherent to the device. Let's say you have I remember in Culpeper, Virginia, they had the locality ran I think they called it a peak plant or a shaving plant, and they generated electricity, had a bunch of transformers, and then had that on demand when they needed it. Well, those oil-filled transformers count towards your storage capacity. Now, for regulatory purposes, we treat them different, but they are regulated. It has to be oil and oil products, so we only regulate oil. We do not regulate chemicals per se. We only regulate oil and oil products. We do regulate animal fats and vegetable oils if you store those. The facility has to be non-transportation related. Simply put, this means that the facility is a fixed facility, and it's not, when we talk about transportation or non-transportation related, we're talking about the transportation of the oil, not the way the facility operates. So like an airport, yes, they're involved in transportation, but relative to the transportation of oil, once the oil has reached its destination where it's stored or being manipulated, that's EPA jurisdiction. But between those facilities, that's typically either DOT for pipelines, it could be BSEE for an offshore facility, it could be the United States Coast Guard. If you have a large facility transfers over water, they regulate the vessel transfer to the first valve inside secondary containment. So there's a lot of interaction there, but EPA basically is regulating these landlocked facilities in the country for prevention planning. The next is it has to be a reasonable expectation. That's a sheen, reaching water from the facility. So can your facility cause an oil spill to cause a sheen? And then finally, there's a capacity threshold, and they're very low, greater than 1320 above ground, or greater than 42,000 below ground. For the below ground threshold, and it's important, in the regulatory world, words have meaning. It's or there. So you break either of those, and all contain. And you only count containers 55 gallons or greater. But if you reach that threshold of greater than 1320, you have to do an SPCC plan for above ground storage. Now, completely buried is a little bit different in that a majority of our regulated tank universe is now exempt, because what we say is if you're regulated under the UST program, SPCC doesn't apply. Typically for a locality or tribe, the thing that would fall back into our program, a UST that would fall back into our program, would probably be something like a, well, it won't be probably, it would be consumptive use heating oil tank. That's it's an oddball underground storage tank that may fall back into our jurisdiction because it's not regulated by the UST program or by a state equivalent program. So that gets a little tricky, but for the most part, the threshold that's typically triggered is greater than 1320. And once that threshold has been met, all tanks are regulated greater than 55 gallons that contain oil unless they enjoy an exemption. So here are those capacity thresholds again. Real quickly, the exemptions, just in case you would be wondering, well, what is not counted? Well, the first thing is not counted is if you permanently close a tank within the definitions in our rule, that takes it out of inventory. So you have the ability to close it out, and I know the localities have similar functions for like USTs and all that. Our rule doesn't say you have to remove the tank. You have to do certain things to make sure it's closed out and market as such, but we do not require removal. What are the exemption? Underground storage tanks for the technical requirements. We just went through that. So if it's a UST and it's subject to the federal program or state program, it's out. We don't regulate the flow-through portions of wastewater treatment facility. This is really important for you guys because I know some of you may be wastewater treatment operators. And please, I have gotten this question quite a bit. This is not a facility-wide exemption. So what we don't regulate is the flow-through process, like from going back to my inspection days in Virginia, the headworks, the clarifiers, all the way to the digesters and active, aerobic, I'm probably making a fool of myself now, to where you have your discharge. That is all something that we don't touch upon, because theoretically there could be oil in that. That's under an NPDES permit. However, if that wastewater treatment facility has, and will almost always have, backup power generators, and those generators are greater than 1320, those are SPCC regulated. So that is not a facility-wide exemption. And that's certainly important for you guys. Also important, motive power containers. So if you have a truck yard, and all it is trucks, you don't do any fueling, and there's only the containers that store fuel for the propulsion of the vehicle, those are out. Some additional things, hot mix asphalt. Again, this may be important for a locality for a road maintenance facility. We do regulate asphalt cement. We do regulate emulsions. We do not regulate hot mix asphalt, where that is the asphalt mixed with an aggregate. So, road materials, basically what it boils down to. We don't regulate heating oil containers for residents. Pesticide application equipment. Again, this may be something that touches you guys. If you have a yard where you're doing, work like a construction yard or maintenance yard, we don't regulate pesticide application equipment. You might ask why. There's in the pesticide formulations, there's called adjuvant oil, and the adjuvant oil itself can, it's an oil, and so when you mix it with the active, not the active, the agent, the pesticide or herbicide, that mixing container and any application is exempt, even though there's oil in it. Now, the adjuvant oil, if it's stored onto its own and it's the facility is otherwise regulated, that is regulated. Now, typically it won't, because the adjuvant oils are in, typically in containers less than 55 gallons. There have been some IBCs and other these plastic containers that may be a little bit larger, but that's important. So we only regulate the adjuvant oil when it's on its own. The next one I don't think applies to most of you, but there are certain USTs for backup power at a nuclear generation facility, power generation facility, and those are exempt. And then interfacility gathering lines for our tribal folks out there, this may be of interest, is basically if the owner operator of a lease decides to put a big box around multiple leases, any of those lines in between those that are in the gathering process may be subject to SPCC unless there are federal requirements under 49 CFR 192 and 195. Right now, there are no regulatory requirements that we're aware of, so we still regulate those until they're picked up by DOT. Okay, so I just went through our flow chart. So again, real quickly, is transportation related? Is a fixed facility? And then it probably is ours. Does it do one of the verbs, including use? Next box, could it be expected to discharge oil in a quantity that's harmful? If it does, then you get to the aggregates at the end we just went through. You put it through the filter of the exemptions, add everything up, and if you're over 1320 or 42,000, which again most likely you won't, you get to the bottom box. If there's a no in one of those, you're not regulated. Okay, so what do you got to do? The objective is to prepare a plan, and your job is to do that. It can be in writing, it can be electronic. We have preamble language to support that. We've already talked about the compliance dates. There are some plans that are certified. As a general rule, again, this is just a rule of thumb, if you're a facility over 10,000 gallons, you're going to have a PE involved. There are some facilities less than 10,000 that also may need to be have a PE involved, but as we'll go over in a moment, facilities with 10,000 gallons or less have an option to develop a plant without a PE, and that's a pretty big cost savings measure. So we're getting right to that. Qualified facilities. So what we've provided in the rule is an option to get out of that PE certification of the plant. It is an option. You always can develop a PE certified plant even if you're less than 10,000. It's up to the facility. So what we have set up is a set of tiers, 2 tiers that allow you to basically draft your own plan. And we have tier 2 and tier 1. And I'm going to go through this right now. Eligibility is very easy. So you've already made the determination. We've walked through the boxes that we've talked about it. I'm SPCC regulated. Well, now you walk through these fairly easy criteria, and you will be able to tell whether or not you have the option for one of our tiered plans with no PE certification. Okay, so the term of art is you want to become a qualified facility. And when you become a qualified facility, you're automatically tier 2, and we'll talk about what that is. So to be a qualified facility, and you're going to self-certify, let's say today, you look back 3 years and you look to see whether you had 2 oil spills of 42 greater than 42 gallons or greater within a 12-month period, or 1,000 gallon spill, you are not able to self-certify. So we say you have to have a clean spill history. So you can't have 2 spills of greater than 42 in a rolling 12-month period, or a single 1,000 gallon spill. If you can say, I haven't had anything, check the box, you've met the first criteria. The other one is 10,000 gallons. So if you have 10,000 gallons or less, then you make the second criteria, you are a qualified facility. That means all qualified facilities, second bullet, are tier 2. What does that mean? That means you're going to do the full SPCC plan. So you take our sample plan that's on our webpage, which we'll show you, and you fill that out, but you are certifying the plant, not the PE. Then we have added another tier of our most, our facilities that we believe pose the least risk, and we wanted to provide even more regulatory relief. And these are tier 1 facilities. So you go through that same criteria again. 1, am I SPCC regulated? We go through the boxes we just went through. Then we go through these 2 criteria: clean spill history, 10,000 gallons or less, and then we add one more criterion, and that is qualified facilities have no AST larger than 5,000 gallons. So if you have no tank larger than 5,000 gallons, then you get to use a template that is in the rules. So EPA has developed a plan for you. One of the things about that template is we've taken out certain requirements that don't make sense because the facilities this small are not going to have loading racks and things of that nature. So please do not use the tier 1 template as a template for your tier 2 plan or a full-blown plan. It'll get you in trouble because we've left things out by design. So you certify that. It's fairly straightforward. Just some issues with this. Obviously, we get into some kind of interesting issues here because PE certification is a matter of state law. There are certain states that have said the act of certifying an SPCC plan, even if it's tier 1 or tier 2, is an act of engineering and you're violating state law. That's not an EPA issue. It might be an issue with state law. There's a couple of states where that's the issue. Again, I would check with my state to see whether or not you can self-certify plans. It's only a couple. Here's what the template looks like. You just fill it out and you're done. There's your plan. Now, again, that's step 1. You got to implement it. So filling out the template is one thing, implementing it's another. Okay, so let's talk about the general rule requirements. Now we've talked about your options. So you're either going to do a full SPCC plan with a PE, or you're going to do a plan with self-certification. So plan format, again, it can be a writing, electronic version of this is fine. Approval of management. It has to list out the methods for responding to a spill, reporting, things of that nature. One of the big requirements is general secondary containment. So this is the minimum containment requirement for everything at the facility that's regulated. So this could be piping, this could be oil-filled equipment like transformers, and even bulk storage tanks. And what that says, very simply, is you must have a form of containment. And when determining the size of that containment, you need to only address the typical failure mode or the most likely quantity of discharges of oil. It can be active or passive in design. What does that mean? What that means is, at a minimum for your piping and tanks, now we're going to get into a more stringent requirement for bulk tanks in a moment, but for your piping, oil-filled equipment, and again, the minimum for a tank, you have to have containment to address the most likely discharge. The point of this is you determine the size of the release, not the government. We don't set it. And there's no freeboard requirement for rain events. So it's just kind of a general coverall. So there's a lot of flexibility, but there's a lot of room for taking risk. If you're a facility that's right on top of the water and you got piping there, you're probably going to want to take a very conservative approach to addressing containment, as opposed to a facility that may not pose that same risk, that may be quite a distance away from a water body. But again, it provides a lot of flexibility. For this and the size containment requirement we're going to talk about in a minute, it certainly does allow for the ability to use, say I can't build containment, a PE has to be involved, and you make an impracticability claim, and essentially what you're allowed to do is do a contingency plan. So what does that mean? It's typically because the facility, things have grown up around it and they can't build containment. You just can't use cost, but things that you can use outside of cost would be space, fire code, safety, things of that nature. So that is, we've seen that. What do you got to do if you do impracticability? Because remember, what you're doing is saying, I can't put in containment. Now, this applies for both the general containment and the size that we're talking about in a moment. What it says is, hey, I'm going to use a response plan. So basically, instead of containment, I'm going to respond to the spill. So not only do you have to have a plan, a 109 plan as we call it, and we have a copy of one in our guidance sample plan, but you have to be able to respond in a way that you're able to contain the oil and address any spills from your facility in lieu of having containment. But most importantly, you got to know when you had the spill. So impracticability has its place, but again, it has its disadvantages. Real quickly, for oil-filled equipment, I just want to highlight, because again, I'm highlighting that we're not going through all the components in the rule today, but I'm highlighting on things that I think are more driven towards the locality. So again, oil-filled equipment, this may be hydraulic units, this may be more likely than not, it's going to be the electrical equipment that you own as opposed to the electrical utility. There's an option here. Again, you go, these numbers should look familiar. There's an eligibility requirement that you look at the oil-filled equipment. If it has no single discharge of 1,000 gallons or greater, or two discharge greater than 42 gallons within a 12-month period, then you can go straight to a contingency plan. You don't have to have the PE involved, but that's only for oil-filled operational equipment, which is specifically defined in the rule. And that includes transformers, these hydraulic units, and things of that nature. So that's a pretty good break. So what do you have to do? You develop a plan, but you have to have an inspection and monitoring program so you know when to implement that plan. And again, no impracticability determination is required. Okay. It is not for oil-filled manufacturing equipment. I don't think that would be an issue with you guys. This is things that you would find in a refinery, but that's where oil is manipulated, so they don't get that break. I don't think with this audience that's an issue. So now let's go into the bulk storage requirements. So this is going to be the bread and butter of the more stringent requirements for a majority of your facilities. They're broken into 4 pieces: facility drainage, bulk storage, containment, drainage, and facility transfer or piping. So real quick, I know you guys can't answer directly, but maybe towards the end, well, I'm going to give it away. There's a lot of problems here, but the biggest problem here is one of the provisions is you have to use and operate a tank in accordance with its design requirements. And there's 3 tanks here, and the key as an inspector, what we always tell our inspector, if you look at the penetrations of the tank and the middle tank, and everything's in a straight line, including the lift, for lifting the tank, that's typically an underground storage tank. And what this facility done here is put underground storage tanks above ground. That is not allowed under our program. We call those convertizontals. Okay, so what do you have to have? You have to have size containment. So in addition to that general containment for your bulk storage containers, this doesn't include this oil-filled equipment, just your bulk containers. That's everything from a 55-gallon drum to a 1 million gallon field-directed container. You must have size containment. The size containment is set by the government here, and that is it must be large enough for the single largest tank in a containment area plus freeboard for a rain event. There's a similar requirement at loading racks where you have to have the single largest container for a truck or compartment, but there is no freeboard for a rain event on that. That's actually a typo on the slide, I shouldn't say that. But for your big tanks, generators and gensets, I should mention this right now, gensets have bulk storage tanks on them. They generate electricity. They don't get the oil field equipment break unless the lubrication is large enough. But there's a storage tank underneath that, and you have to have size containment. So again, there are different things. I'm sorry about this. Turn this phone off. But there are some other areas where we do set sizing, as I mentioned, loading and unloading, bulk storage containers, and then mobile portable containers, so drums, IBCs. All of these must have size containment for the container and that freeboard for a rain event. That also carries over in the production universe. Production facilities have to have that size containment also. The containment must be sufficiently impervious, so it doesn't allow the oil to leak out of the system. That is a performance-based standard, must be documented in the SPCC plan. The next thing is integrity testing. So for most of your containers at a locality or a tribal area, if they're smaller shop-built tanks, typically they'll be inspected under SP 001. It will involve some form of a visual inspection monthly, and then an annual inspection that can be done by the facility. But then, depending on the size and configuration, it may include some additional testing for by a professional. So it would be some non-destructive testing and looking at UT measurements on the outside of the tank for corrosion. As you get into larger field-erected tanks, you're looking at basically a professional coming in and doing those evaluations and determining how long that tank can operate before you would have a breakthrough in corrosion in the floor, which is driving that calculation. So super important. And again, this does not apply to that oil field equipment. So that's that break I was telling you about. The transformers and hydraulic units don't have to deal with that. This is, I can't preach enough about this, and that is oil, overfill protection. I was just talking to somebody on the phone right before I said, a tribal partner actually, and overfill is super important. You've got to know how much a tank can hold relative to when you're transferring into it, and there are devices that will help you gauge the tank as well as shut down transfer or give you an alarm when the tank gets to a certain level. You have to have that on the tank, and then you have you don't have to have it on a drum. Anything that's where you're not filling it again, you don't have to have it. But for a typical tank that you're filling, you have to have overfill protection. And it's super important to test it, make sure it works. If you don't, you get this, and you lose your product. This is a big tank, and the oil came out. Those are called eyebrow vents. That's the vents above the floor, the roof that's floating in there, and they've jacked the roof probably into the external roof and caused damage, and that's how they had an overfill. So that's bad news. For piping, you have to protect that piping. After August 16, 2002, any piping that has been buried must be cathodically protected and must satisfy the corrosion of 280 or 281. So in other words, you're treating it like you treat piping under the UST program. Applies to all soil conditions. Whenever you expose buried piping, it must be inspected for corrosion, and you need to take corrective action. Also, there is this, and this is really where the localities kind of come into play. Your code enforcement and people, anytime you install buried piping, alter it, repair it, or take it or alter it, I should say, you have to do testing of that piping, and again, and address any actions if you find a problem. Okay, so here are our folks in the field. Run a little long. We'll start taking questions at 150 as opposed to 145. I'm just a little bit off, but I want to show you these pictures. Here's our contacts in the field. Again, we'll show you the access to our website. You can get to these folks. You can also contact me. We have a hotline to answer questions. We do not track that for inspection purposes. So you can call them and ask questions. Most of the questions they can answer. But if you get to this site, you'll be able to see the types of folks in the different regions, get to know them, and they are my counterparts. I'm the head of the program in DC, and these folks implement the program in the field in the different regions. Okay, so here's the good part, findings from the field. So I'm gonna buzz through these real quick, but these will give you some ideas of, if you see things like this, maybe you wanna contact your local EPA representative in the region. So let's take a look. This is full of stuff right here. I mean, if I'm an inspector or I'm in a locality, I'm gonna say, whoa, we're a tribal area. I'm gonna say, Well, number one, the middle tanks has had overfills. The other tanks on the side appear to have venting problems, and they've collapsed the tank. They've sucked them in, and that tank at the end, I would ask, how many times have you inspected that? And then as a code official, I'd be looking at, and you can barely see it. I think we have some close-ups. But if you look at that transfer piping, it's held up by a piece of wood. It's a flammable combustible material. You don't want that. This is a big signal for us. Buckets of oil housekeeping typically means there's problems. If you look at this facility, they have gravel all over the bottom area of the tank, so it can't be inspected. They have ball valves. If you look at that tank in the middle, a ball valve that's unsecured that could release the entire contents of the tank along with this other one. It looks like a stinger that goes to the top, but the one in the middle, you literally could walk by, accidentally hit that ball valve and start a tank leak and not know it and drain the entire contents of the tank. Housekeeping, housekeeping, housekeeping. Just because you have a double wall tank doesn't mean that you are done. And in this case, they are not really good with their housekeeping. Frac tanks, especially on tribal lands, you may see these from oil companies. Unless they're double walled, they have to have containment if they contain oil and water mixtures. Don't use your secondary containment device as a oil storage area or trash bin. If you look at this, it's got fire issues. Obviously, they've got leakage, but you don't want to use secondary containment as your storage area. This is another hint. Whether you own the facility or you're a locality or tribe looking at it, transfer areas, a very high risk area for spills or discharges. In this case, the facilities, what we call a manifold that takes the oil from the trucks to the facility, as well as the top loading devices you see. This is where the transfers are. Something is leaking in that manifold. Now, if that's a flammable liquid, that's a big problem. So again, housekeeping. This, I really like this picture because it says a lot as an inspector. There's a lot going on here. Number one, their containment, beautifully poured concrete with a crack in it, isn't containment. Second issue, you have piping penetrations that go through the wall, and guess what? There's potential that they could have holes in that. And then these tanks are completely buried and parched, so you can't inspect the bottom. The piping is in gravel and material, so it creates corrosion cells. This is not a good practice, and it changes the drainage around the facility. So that's a problem. Tanker trucks store oil, you got to be careful. In this case, it was a truck, had a small leak, migrated out from the facility, went into a fish hatchery and killed everything there. Penetrations in a dike wall. Holes in a dike wall, that means you no longer have containment up to the point where that hole is. So if it's at the bottom, you have no containment. We see this all the time. Cinder blocks. It's very difficult to maintain cinder blocks for containment, and they also should be sealed properly such that they are sufficiently impervious, and they're subject to cracking and things like that. So they're not the best containment in the world. This was just an interesting thing at a facility where they decided the valve had actually froze, so they couldn't get the stem up and down. So they knocked the piece of piping out and just used it as a plug. Well, we came there, this was out. That means they have no containment. You're beginning to see a pattern here. The containment structure with a hole in it is no longer containment. We see this a lot. This is in the upstream production areas, but you see it downstream. Vegetation in and around a tank. You can inspect the tank. It promotes an area where if you do inspections, you may have some critters there you don't want to find. Also, from the code official standpoint, flammable combustible materials in your site secondary containment may be viewed as from your locality standpoint as a violation of NFPA 30 or local fire code. So lots of issues there. Again, if you cut holes, this is a different from the top. Cutouts in containment lowers that containment structure's capacity. Leaking valves. Discharges from tanks. So you have tank water bottoms that look, they didn't inspect it. I doubt this is a practice that didn't end up in a problem. So you got to know what you're discharging. Next, improper tank patching. This is in the oil field upstream. You don't use a twig to patch a metal tank. Improper modifications. It looks like what they were trying to do. This is in the upstream world, trying to make a mod on the tank relative to skimming I think they're trying to make a shotgun skimmer out of this, but anyways, it's not a proper tank modification. This is just interesting because it's this this inspection. We looked at their inspection record and they kept inspecting this thing, saying it was damaged, but never did anything to it to fix it. And then this one's bizarre. You'll never believe it. With earthen materials, critters love to dig into those earthen materials. And in this case, you won't believe it, it was a turtle. But we find holes in containment all the time from burrowing animals, and it's a real thing. Double wall tanks. I do want to hop on this, and then we got 3 minutes, and then we'll close out and start taking some questions. A lot of localities have these, and tribal folks have these. Now, double wall tanks are great. You have a tank inside of a tank. And like I said, right before this call, I was talking to a tribal partner about this. That's one component of the rule. Remember, I talked about general containment. So you also have to address spills from that transfer area with the hose, filling the tank, because it might result in an overfill, which obviously occurred here, or it could, depending if it's cam locked, you could push the product out the vent. So you may have to either build some form of containment. It's general, so you size it. And it may be something that you can implement using a spill kit, but you have to address that. And then the second thing is, with a double wall tank, you've got to look at the interstice. So in other words, you're checking in that interstice for fuel. There's some pretty cheap things on the market that you can put on that tank, and it will give you a visual cue whether or not there's liquid in that tank. Because if you have a release from the inner tank to the outer tank, now we consider that a single-walled storage tank with no containment. That is not a good thing. Same thing here. Beautiful double wall tank system, overfills. And where did it go? There's no containment. This, I call this on Golden Pond. You never want to do this with a tank. They clearly have sufficiently impervious knocked out, but so much so that they have the bottom of the tank buried underwater. And that's just asking for side shell corrosion and bottom side corrosion of the container. So you gotta be very cognizant of something like that and manage your water properly. And you can't tell me that you can inspect a tank when you got all that vegetation around. We do have a lot of great facilities. Here's an example that's got everything: double wall piping, beautiful tanks, beautiful secondary containment. I love that red chair. I don't know if that's the red chair of pain where somebody does something wrong and they have to sit there, but they have their red chair there. And then to the far left, they have this little compartment for transfers, so that if there's any spillage, they can put it in that what looks like a desk. So real quick, I want to give you this, and then we're going to take some questions. So I'm going to hit 150 around the numbers. We have an upcoming outreach event. So again, I would ask you to go to our website, www.epa.gov/oil spill, singular, and click on that. And then on the What's New side, you'll see an advertisement for this outreach webinar. This is a little bit longer. It's about 2 hours and 15 minutes. And we go over even more details on some of the findings that we found in 18 and 19 at SPCC and FRP facilities. So also our website, as I mentioned, the hotline, 1-800-424-9346 is available for you to call, and you can ask them any question. We don't track it. If they can't answer it, it comes to me. 90% of the questions that I get can be answered by the hotline. So please use that resource. And that takes us to a big thank you and opening this up for questions. So I'm going to bring in Kelly Brantner, again from AWECA's Office of Civil Enforcement, and John, who's our compliance guy from AWECA, and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mark. And we have quite a few questions already. So we'll start with one that came in advance. And it was, is there any container size cutoff where the volume of the container need not be counted toward the overall volume of the site?
Yes, you count all containers that are 55 gallons or greater. That's the de minimis size. Go ahead.
That's a pretty straightforward one.
Yep.
One person mentioned that they had utilized the EPA website SPCC applicability tool to see if the fuel tank farm for a large municipal airport was subject to the rule, but the tool made it seem like since the airport was transportation related, it was not subject to the rule.
Yes, that's an incorrect analysis. As I mentioned earlier, it's not whether the facility is involved in transportation. Transportation in the context of applicability means the transportation of oil. So If that airport stores oil, it is regulated, absolutely regulated, if it's over the threshold. And you've got my name and number up there. Send me an email. I can set up a Teams and we can walk through your applicability. I'd be more than happy to do that. But more, if you've got over 1320, which you're going to have at an airport, you're going to be regulated. The transportation piece does not knock you out. Okay.
Yeah. And we have a question about whether the rule applies to gas pumps at county-owned facilities.
Yes, it does if it's otherwise subject. So what that means is if you have over 1320 in above ground storage tanks that may be attached to a dispenser, yes, the transfer to the vehicle, even though the vehicle wouldn't be counted because of motive power, but the transfer would be regulated if you break the threshold. The good news is general containment, typically a spill kit can take care of that. It gets a little bit more complicated with USTs. So again, if you have both USTs and ASTs, we don't regulate USTs, but at an otherwise regulated SPCC facility, so you break the threshold on above ground and you have some underground tanks, even though we don't regulate the underground tanks, if it's an SPC facility, the transfers from the dispensers are actually subject to the SPCC rule because the dispensers are not part of the UST system. So again, if you have a question on that, I can clarify. It's a little bit complicated, but in short, facility is otherwise regulated because of ASTs that has USTs on the same site. Those transfers, we don't regulate anything on the tanks, but the transfers and those equipment will be subject to basically just a general containment requirement. Again, possibly a spill kit could take care of that.
I'll answer the next one directly because we have a few questions asking about where the presentation materials can be found, et cetera. And those will all be on the LGene website shortly. So
yes,
this is heads up for folks. And thanks to Mark and we'll also post a number of these resources that Mark has mentioned. So I encourage you to check that, and of course to check out the EPA websites that Mark has pointed out. We have a question also about soil. So does the SPCC rule apply to a storage pile of soil saturated with an oil product observably impacting waters via leaching?
That's a tricky one. This is one I may have Kelly weigh in on, but my read would be there isn't a container per se. So we regulate facilities and we base that on container capacity. So I don't know that you would trigger it. Now you may have other issues there that may be subject to, response under the NCP. And here's the thing: if it's leaking oil and it gets to a stream, you are violating the law. Forget SPCC, that's the prevention part. It's not a good practice. The only way I could see that happening is if it was part of a pond that you were arguing was a container. So generally, I don't know that the SPCC could be applied because there's not a container. I don't know, Kelly, if you have a different opinion.
That's what I was going to say. I need a little bit more information, but basically oil coming from anything, if it gets into the water, you're in violation of the Clean Water Act. So like it sounds like you've got some other issues there going on. So right.
And whether or not SPCC applies or not, it doesn't matter because it's a strict liability for the oil spill. That's what you should be addressing up front, because SPCC is the prevention part. You just need to take care of that. You shouldn't have that occurring. Okay, next question.
This one's going out a little bit. Can you give some basic examples of things people think apply to this rule but don't actually, or things people don't think apply but do?
Oh, excellent question. Well, we've already had one. Transportation related. My facility has trucks or aircraft and it's involved in transportation, so I'm out. Again, transportation for our applicability purposes is specifically related to the transportation of the oil, not the activity of the facility. So it really boils down to, is the oil coming in by pipeline, by truck? Those are the things that fall out. So that would be one. The other is things that you think that would be regulated wouldn't be oil field equipment, like transformers that you own and operate. That counts towards your facility capacity. We often see that's not the case. On the reverse side, we don't regulate chemicals. So if it's a Clean Water Act hazardous substance, it is out, or a chemical. It's not a petroleum or animal fat and vegetable oil. we don't regulate those and they don't fall within our purview. So trying to think what else. Probably the big one too is whether or not it can impact waters in the United States. And as currently there's a lot of discussion about, we did a rule last year and certain features like ephemeral streams are no longer considered waters of the United States, and that may impact applicability, particularly in our tribal areas that are remote, that may have production facilities. So that's a questionable area right now. Okay, next.
And we have just a couple of minutes. So are oil field production holding vessels, ASTs, exempt?
No.
And we have one, I think you touched on this earlier, but if it is an SPCC plan also required for facilities that recycle non-petroleum such as non-BTX oils, oils such as vegetable oils?
Yes. These are easy.
Well, these are good questions, and it's
They're fantastic questions. No, I'm not being flippant. I'm just saying these are easy. These are regulated facilities. Now, again, when I say yes, please walk it through those check boxes. Greater than 1320, non-transportation related, can impact water. So I'm making that assumption, but we're talking capacities and different types of facilities. These are regulated if they meet the requirements. So I should caveat that.
We're very lucky to have your expertise, Mark. And we have one as antifreeze considered oil.
No.
And since we're wrapping up now, I'd be curious, could we get a final takeaway from each of you? Just something you really want to make certain that our audience keeps in mind.
Yes, I'll go first and then I'll let Kelly and John wrap it up. I would say from my perspective, we're kind of a unique program in that most of our inspectors are OSCs, so they do response work. We're here to help. We treat the opportunity of an inspection as our ability to work with folks, particularly, the folks that we may respond with, in localities or tribes. So it's always an opportunity for us to get to know people, get to know their facility, and we strive to bring facilities into compliance. But in some cases, if they're recalcitrant or, as Kelly said, has a spill, things migrate from our office to enforcement. So my job is to keep the oil out of the water and do everything I can to keep you in compliance, because we all want clean water and we don't want oil spills. And this is a very easy program to comply with to make that happen. And we're always here to answer questions. You can call me, you can email me, and we'll get back to you. So that's my ending remark. Kelly?
I guess, I always like to joke around that, listen to Mark, otherwise you're going to have to deal with me, and I'm not as nice as Mark. But really, it's, we are here to help. And like Mark said too, is, when the inspectors are there, they're there to help you bring it into compliance. And sometimes you will end up in enforcement, but we try to, we try to avoid that. We try to get you into compliance, and, we're all trying to prevent the oil from getting in the water and just trying to, help the environment. So, we're always here to help. Any questions? Like I said, you've got Mark's information, and so any way we can help as well.
John?
Yeah, I'll just emphasize again that Mark's website up there, epa.gov/oil spill, has lots of great information, fact sheets, guidance, other webinars. Definitely check that out, and then use the hotline if you have questions. And
I don't know to wrap this up, but if we can, I can stay on and continue to answer questions, but I'll leave that up to you. So I'm going to turn it back to our hosts, and I want to thank them for giving us the opportunity at EPA to do this and working through AWECA. We really appreciate the folks at the Environmental Law Institute for making this happen. This is a great thing. And again, feel free to call me anytime.
Well, we're so lucky to have all three of you here. And thank you so much, Mark, John, Kelly. If we can advance the next slide there, we have the required plug, right? So we really appreciate you all shedding light on how the rule applies to local and tribal governments, as well as owners and operators of facilities where oil is stored and used. And we often think about governments as the regulators or enforcers of these rules protecting our water bodies. So it's a bit of a shift to discussing how local and tribal governments also play a role as regulated parties. So also on how you can set an example for everyone else. So again, we greatly appreciate all three of you sharing your expertise and words of wisdom for our audience. And we really appreciate our audience joining us. And advantage of the resources mentioned today, as well as reach out to our experts who have so generously provided their contact information. So you can see all three of them are just an enormous wealth of information. So again, we'll be posting the presentation, these resources on the LGENE website, and we really encourage you to check out lgene.net for just a wealth of resources on how local and tribal governments can meet their federal environmental obligations from water to soil to air, and to connect with us on social media too. Thank you all so much.